In 1945, the British Empire had just won World War II, but behind the victory was a terrifying reality. Britain owed massive amounts of money, not just to allies, but to the very colonies it controlled. Countries like India were holding billions in unpaid promises, money Britain didn't actually have. So when those colonies demanded independence, they weren't just breaking free, they were pulling the financial foundation out from under the empire itself. And without that hidden support, the most powerful empire in history collapsed faster than anyone expected. At its peak, the British Empire was everywhere. Its ships ruled the oceans, its currency moved across continents, its influence shaped global trade. There was a saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And it wasn't an exaggeration. From India to Africa, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, Britain controlled vast populations, resources, and trade routes. On the surface, it looked unstoppable. But empires don't run on pride. They run on money. And the deeper you looked, the more fragile that system became. Running an empire isn't cheap. You need armies to enforce control, administrators to govern distant lands, railways, ports, and telegraphs to keep everything connected. Every mile of control costs money, and Britain wasn't just spending a little. It was spending massively. At first, this was manageable. The empire generated wealth through trade and taxation. But over time, something changed. Expenses started growing faster than income. And instead of slowing down, Britain made a dangerous choice. It started borrowing. Not because it was weak, but because borrowing made it look strong. To the outside world, Britain still looked rich. London was the financial center of the world. Its banks financed global trade. Its currency was trusted everywhere. But behind that image, Britain was stacking debt. Not just normal debt, a complex web of obligations spread across its empire. And here's the twist. It wasn't just borrowing from investors. It was borrowing from its own colonies. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Colonies like India weren't just controlled politically. They were used financially. Taxes collected from Indian citizens funded British administration, British wars, and even British infrastructure projects. Railways built in India, paid for by Indian taxpayers, military campaigns, often financed using colonial resources. But it didn't stop there. Britain also raised loans in London and guaranteed them using colonial revenues, which meant if anything went wrong, the colonies would still have to pay. Imagine funding your boss's lifestyle while being told it's for your own benefit. Then came World War I, and everything changed. The cost of war exploded. Weapons, troops, logistics. Britain needed money, fast, so it borrowed heavily, not just internally, but from a rising global power, the United States. For the first time, Britain wasn't just managing its own empire's finances, it was now dependent on external creditors. And external creditors don't care about empires. They care about repayment. After the war, Britain faced a brutal reality. It was deep in debt, its economy was weakened, and unrest in the colonies was growing. So what did it do? It leaned even harder on its empire. More extraction, more financial pressure, more dependence on colonial revenue. But this created a dangerous cycle. The more Britain depended on its colonies, the more unstable the system became. At the center of this system was India. India wasn't just another colony, it was the empire's financial backbone. It generated enormous tax revenue, supported British trade, and absorbed a huge share of imperial costs. But by the early 20th century, India was changing. Nationalist movements were rising, economic exploitation was becoming obvious, and resistance was growing stronger, which meant Britain was about to lose its most important financial support system. And when your biggest source of income starts pushing back, the whole system begins to shake. Then came World War II, and this time, the cost was even worse. Britain was already weakened, but it had no choice, it had to fight. So once again, it borrowed. But now something different happened. Instead of paying its colonies in real money, Britain started paying them in promises. This is the hidden mechanism that changed everything. During the war, Britain bought goods, resources, and support from its colonies. But instead of paying immediately, it issued IOUs. These were recorded as something called sterling balances. On paper, it looked fine. Numbers in accounts, balances in currency. But in reality, it was debt, massive debt. Countries like India accumulated billions in these balances, which meant Britain owed them huge amounts of money. Money it didn't actually have. It's like writing checks, knowing your account is empty. After World War II ended, the illusion collapsed. Colonies began demanding independence, but they also wanted something else. Their money, India in particular, held enormous sterling balances. And Britain faced an impossible choice: pay the debt and risk economic collapse, or refuse and lose political control. Either way, the empire was in trouble. Maintaining the empire had become too expensive. Military costs were rising, administration costs were rising, debt obligations were overwhelming. The system that once created power was now destroying it. Britain could no longer afford to be an empire. What happened next shocked the world. In 1947, India gained independence. Soon after, other colonies followed. Within a few decades, the British Empire had effectively dissolved. Not slowly, but rapidly, because once the financial foundation disappeared, the structure couldn't hold. Empires don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when they can't pay their bills. History often tells us that empires fall because of war, or rebellion, or weak leadership. But the British Empire reveals a deeper truth. Power isn't just about control. It's about financial sustainability. When debt grows faster than income, when promises exceed reality, collapse becomes inevitable. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't just history. Modern economies run on debt. Global systems depend on trust. And hidden financial obligations still shape power today. The British Empire didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, slowly, under the weight of commitments it could no longer sustain. So the next time you think about power, don't just look at armies. Don't just look at borders. Look at balance sheets. Look at debt. Look at the invisible promises holding everything together. Because sometimes, the force that builds the greatest empire in the world is the same force that quietly brings it down. If you want to understand how power really works, you don't just follow the money. You follow the debt behind it. Subscribe, because the next story might completely change how you see the world.